Section 8 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 5. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ellie. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 5 by Henry Gray. The Mouse, Part 1. 2a. The Mouse. Cavum oris, oralobuccal cavity. The cavity of the mouse is placed at the commencement of the digestive tube. It is a nearly oval-shaped cavity which consists of two parts, an outer smaller portion, the vestibule, and an inner larger part, the mouse cavity proper. The vestibule, vestibulum oris, is a slit-like space, bounded externally by the lips and cheeks, internally by the gums and teeth. It communicates with the surface of the body by the rima or orifice of the mouth. Above and below, it is limited by the reflection of the mucous membrane from the lips and cheeks to the gum, covering the upper and lower alveolar arch respectively. It receives the secretion from the parotid salivary glands, and communicates, when the jaws are closed, with the mouth cavity proper by an aperture on either side behind the wisdom teeth, and by narrow clefts between opposing teeth. The mouth cavity proper, cavum oris proprium, is bounded laterally and in front by the alveolar arches with their contained teeth. Behind it communicates with the pharynx by a constricted aperture, termed the isthmus faucium. It is roofed in by the hard and soft palates, while the greater part of the floor is formed by the tongue, the remainder by the reflection of the mucous membrane from the sides and under surface of the tongue to the gum lining of the inner aspect of the mandible. It receives the secretion from the submaxillary and sublingual salivary glands. Structure. The mucous membrane lining the mouth is continuous with the integument at the free margin of the lips, and with the mucous lining of the pharynx behind. It is of a rose-pink tinge during life, and very thick where it overlies the hard parts bounding the cavity. It is covered by stratified squamous epithelium. The lips, labia oris, the two fleshy folds which surround the rima or orifice of the mouth, are formed externally of integument and internally of mucous membrane, between which are found the orbicularis oris muscle, the labial vessels, some nerves, areolar tissue and fat, and numerous small labial glands. The inner surface of each lip is connected in the middle line to the corresponding gum by a fold of mucous membrane, the frenulum, the upper being the larger. The labial glands, glandulae labialis, are situated between the mucous membrane and the orbicularis oris around the orifice of the mouth. They are circular in form and about the size of small peas. Their ducts open by minute orifices upon the mucous membrane. In structure, they resemble the salivary glands. The cheeks, buccae, form the sides of the face and are continuous in front with the lips. They are composed externally of integument, internally of mucous membrane, and between the two of a muscular stratum, besides a large quantity of fat, areolar tissue, vessels, nerves, and buccal glands. Structure. The mucous membrane lining the cheek is reflected above and below upon the gums and is continuous behind with the lining membrane of the soft palate. Opposite the second molar tooth of the mandibula is a papilla, on the summit of which is the aperture of the parotid duct. The principal muscle of the cheek is the buccinator, but other muscles enter into this formation, the zygomaticus, risorius, and platysma. The buccal glands are placed between the mucous membrane and buccinator muscle. They are similar in structure to the labial glands, but smaller. About 5, of a larger size than the rest, are placed between the masseter and the buccinator muscles, around the distal extremity of the parotid ducts. The ducts open in the mouth opposite the last molar tooth. They are called molar glands. The gums, gingivae, are composed of a dense fibrous tissue, closely connected to the periosteum of the alveolar processes, and surrounding the necks of the teeth. They are covered by smooth and vascular mucous membrane, which is remarkable for its limited sensibility. Around the necks of the teeth this membrane presents numerous fine papillae, and is reflected into the alveoli, where it is continuous with the periostal membrane lining these cavities. The palate, palatum, forms the roof of the mouth. It consists of two portions, the hard palate in front, the soft palate behind. The hard palate, palatum durum, is bounded in front and at the sides by the alveolar arches and gums. Behind it is continuous with the soft palate. It is covered by a dense structure, formed by the periosteum and mucous membrane of the mouth, which are intimately adherent. Along the middle line is a linea raphe, which ends anteriorly in a small papilla corresponding with the incisive canal. On either side and in front of the raphe, the mucous membrane is thick, pale in color and corrugated. Behind, it is thin, smooth, and of a deeper color. It is covered with stratified squamous epithelium, and furnished with numerous palatinal glands, which lie between the mucous membrane and the surface of the bone. The soft palate, palatum molle, is a movable fold, suspended from the posterior border of the hard palate, and forming an incomplete septum between the mouth and the pharynx. It consists of a fold of mucous membrane enclosing muscular fibers, aponeuroses, vessels, nerves, adenoid tissue, and mucous glands. And occupying its usual position, example relaxed and pendant, its anterior surface is concave, continuous with the roof of the mouth, and marked by the median raphe. Its posterior surface is convex, and continuous with the mucous membrane covering the floor of the nasal cavities. Its upper border is attached to the posterior margin of the hard palate, and its sides are blended with the pharynx. Its lower border is free. Its lower portion, which hangs like a curtain between the mouth and pharynx, is termed the palatum velum. Hanging from the middle of its lower border is a small conical pendulous process, the palatine uvula. And arching lateralward and downward from the base of the uvula on either side are two curved folds of mucous membrane, containing muscular fibers, called the arches or pillars of the fauces. The teeth, dentes. Man is provided with two sets of teeth, which make their appearance at different periods of life. Those of the first set appear in childhood, and are called the deciduous or milk teeth. Those of the second set, which appear at an early period, may continue until old age, and are called permanent. The deciduous teeth are 20 in number, 4 incisors, 2 canines, and 4 molars in each jaw. The permanent teeth are 32 in number, 4 incisors, 2 canines, 4 premolars, and 6 molars in each jaw. The dental formula may be represented as follows: deciduous teeth, upper jaw, 2 molars, 1 canine, 2 incisors, 1 canine, 1 molar. Lower jaw, 2 molars, 1 canine, 2 incisors, 1 canine, 2 molars. Total 20. Permanent teeth, upper jaw, 3 molars, 2 premolars, 1 canine, 2 incisors, 1 canine, 2 premolars, 3 molars. Lower jaw, 3 molars, 2 premolars, 1 canine, 2 incisors, 1 canine, 2 premolars, 3 molars. Total 32. General characteristics. Each tooth consists of 3 portions: the crown projecting above the gum, the root embedded in the alveolus, and the neck, the constricted portion between the crown and the root. The roots of the teeth are firmly implanted in depressions within the alveoli. These depressions are lined with periosteum, which invests the tooth as far as the neck. At the margins of the alveoli the periosteum is continuous with the fibrous structure of the gums. In consequence with the curve of the dental arch, terms as anterior and posterior as applied to the teeth are misleading and confusing. Special terms are therefore used to indicate the different surfaces of a tooth. The surface directed toward the lips and the cheek is known as the labial or buccal surface. That directed toward the tongue is described as the lingual surface. Those surfaces which touch neighboring teeth are termed surfaces of contact. In the case of incisor and canine teeth, the surfaces of contact are medial and lateral. In premolar and molar teeth they are anterior and posterior. The superior dental arch is larger than the inferior, so that in the normal condition the teeth in the maxillae slightly overlap those of the mandible both in front and at the sides. Since the upper central incisors are wider than the lower, the other teeth in the upper arch are thrown somewhat distally, and the two sets do not quite correspond to each other when the mouth is closed. Thus the upper canine tooth rests partially on the lower canine, partly on the first premolar, and the cusps of the upper molar teeth lie behind the corresponding cusps of the lower molar teeth. The two series, however, end at nearly the same point behind. This is mainly because the molars in the upper arch are the smaller. End of section 8. Recording by Ellie, February 2010. Of Grey's Anatomy Part 5. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ellie. Anatomy of the Human Body Part 5 by Henry Gray. The Mouse Part 2. The permanent teeth, dentes permanentes. The incisors, Dentes incisivi, incisive for cutting teeth, are so named from their presenting a sharp cutting edge, adapted for biting the food. They are 8 in number and form the 4 front teeth in each dental arch. The crown is directed vertically, and is scissor-shaped, being beveled at the expense of its lingual surface, so as to present a sharp horizontal cutting edge, which, before being subjected to attrition, presents 3 small prominent points, separated by 2 slight notches. It is convex, smooth, and highly polished on its labial surface, concave on its lingual surface, where, in the teeth of the upper arch, it is frequently marked by an inverted V-shaped eminence, situated near the gum. This is known as the basal ridge, or cingulum. The neck is constricted. The root is long, single, conical, transversely flattened, thicker in front than behind, and slightly grooved on either side in the longitudinal direction. The upper incisors are larger and stronger than the lower, and are directed obliquely downward and forward. The central ones are larger than the lateral, and their roots are more rounded. The lower incisors are smaller than the upper. The central ones are smaller than the lateral, and are the smallest of all the incisors. They are placed vertically, and are somewhat beveled in front, where they have been worn down by contact with the overlapping edge of the upper teeth. The cingulum is absent. The canine teeth, dentes canini, are 4 in number, 2 in the upper and 2 in the lower arch, one being placed laterally to each lateral incisor. They are larger and stronger than the incisors, and their roots sink deeply into the bones, and cause well-marked prominences upon the surface. The crown is large and conical, very convex on its labial surface, a little hollowed and uneven on its lingual surface, and tapered to a blunted point or cusp, which projects beyond the level of the other teeth. The root is single, but longer and thicker than that of the incisors, conical in form, compressed laterally, and marked by a single groove on each side. The upper canine teeth, popularly called eye teeth, are larger and longer than the lower, and usually present a distinct basal ridge. The lower canine teeth, popularly called stomach teeth, are placed nearer the middle line than the upper, so that their summits correspond to the intervals between the upper canines and the lateral incisors. The premolars or bicuspid teeth, dentes premolares, are 8 in number, 4 in each arch. They are situated lateral to and behind the canine teeth, and are smaller and shorter than they. The crown is compressed antero-posteriorly, and surmounted by 2 pyramidal eminences or cusps, a labial and a lingual, separated by a groove, hence the name bicuspid. Of the 2 cusps the labial is larger and more prominent. The neck is oval. The root is generally single, compressed, and presents in front and behind a deep groove, which indicates a tendency in the root to become double. The apex is generally bifid. The upper premolars are larger, and present a greater tendency to division of their roots than the lower. This is especially the case in the first upper premolar. The molar teeth, dentes molares, are the largest of the permanent set, and their broad crowns are adapted for grinding and pounding the food. They are 12 in number, 6 in each arch, 3 being placed posterior to each of second premolars. The crown of each is nearly cubical in form, convex on its buccal and lingual surfaces, and flattened on its surfaces of contact. It is surmounted by 4 or 5 tubercles or cusps, separated from each other by a crucial depression. Hence the molars are sometimes termed multicuspids. The neck is distinct, large, and rounded. Upper molars. As a rule, the first is the largest, and the third the smallest of the upper molars. The crown of the first has usually 4 tubercles, that of the second 3 or 4, that of the third 3. Each upper molar has 3 roots, and of these 2 are buccal and nearly parallel to one another. The third is lingual, and diverges from the others as it runs upward. The roots of the third molar, dens serotinus or wisdom tooth, are more or less fused together. Lower molars. The lower molars are larger than the upper. On the crown of the first there are usually 5 tubercles. On those of the second and third 4 or 5. Each lower molar has 2 roots, an anterior, nearly vertical, and a posterior, directed obliquely backward. Both roots are grooved longitudinally, indicating a tendency to division. The 2 roots of the third molar, dens serotinus or wisdom tooth, are more or less united. The deciduous teeth. Dentes decidui, temporary or milk teeth. The deciduous are smaller than, but, generally speaking, resemble in form the teeth which bear the same names in the permanent set. The hinder of the 2 molars is the largest of all the deciduous teeth. It is succeeded by the second premolar. The first upper molar has only 3 cusps, 2 labial and 1 lingual. The second upper molar has 4 cusps. The first lower molar has 4 cusps. The second lower molar has 5. The roots of the deciduous molars are smaller and more divergent than those of the permanent molars, but in other respects bear a strong resemblance to them. Structure of the teeth. On making a vertical section of a tooth, a cavity will be found in the interior of the crown and the center of each root. It opens by a minute orifice at the extremity of the latter. It is called the pulp cavity and contains the dental pulp, a loose connective tissue richly supplied with vessels and nerves, which enter the cavity through the small aperture at the point of each tooth. Some of the cells of the pulp are arranged as a layer on the wall of the pulp cavity. They are named the odontoblasts of Waldeyer, and during the development of the tooth are columnar in shape. But later on, when the dentine is fully formed, they become flattened and resemble osteoblasts. Each has 2 fine processes, the outer one passing into the dental caniculus and the inner being continuous with the processes of the connective tissue cells of the pulp matrix. The solid portion of the tooth consists of the ivory or dentin, which forms the bulk of the tooth, the enamel which covers the exposed part of the crown, and a thin layer of bone, or cement or crust petrosa, which is disposed on the surface of the root. The dentin, substantia burnea, ivory, forms the principal mass of a tooth. It is a modification of osseous tissue, from which it differs, however, in structure. On microscopic examination, it is seen to consist of a number of minute wavy and branching tubes, the dental caniculi, embedded in a dense homogeneous substance, the matrix. The dental caniculi, dentinal tubules, are placed parallel with one another and open at the inner ends into the pulp cavity. In their course to the periphery they present 2 or 3 curves and are twisted on themselves in a spiral direction. These caniculi vary in direction. Thus in the tooth of the mandible they are vertical in the upper portion of the crown, becoming oblique and then horizontal in the neck and upper part of the root, while toward the lower part of the root they are inclined downward. In their course they divide and subdivide dichotomously, and especially in the root give off minute branches, which join together in loops in the matrix or end blindly. Near the periphery of the dentin, the finer ramifications of the caniculi terminate imperceptibly by 3 ends. The dental caniculi have definite walls, consisting of an elastic homogeneous membrane, the dentinal sheath of Neumann, which resists the action of acids. They contain slender cylindrical prolongations of the odontoblasts, first described by Thoms, and named Thoms fibers or dentinal fibers. The matrix, intertubular dentin, is translucent and contains the chief part of the earthy matter of the dentin. In it are a number of fine fibrils, which are continuous with the fibrils of the dental pulp. After the earthy matter has been removed by steeping a tooth in weak acid, the animal bases remaining may be torn into laminae, which run parallel with the pulp cavity across the direction of the tubes. A section of dry dentin often displays a series of somewhat parallel lines, the incremental lines of Salter. These lines are composed of imperfectly calcified dentin arranged in layers. In consequence of the imperfection of the calcifying process, little irregular cavities are left, termed interglobular spaces. Normally a series of these spaces is found toward the outer surface of the dentin, where they form a layer which is sometimes known as a granular layer. They have received their name from the fact that they are surrounded by minute nodules, or globules of dentin. Other curved lines may be seen parallel to the surface. These are the lines of Schreger, and are due to the optical effect of simultaneous curvature of the dental fibers. Chemical composition. According to Berzelius and von Bibra, dentin consists of 28 parts of animal and 72 parts of earthy matter. The animal matter is converted by boiling into gelatin. The earthy matter consists of phosphate of lime, carbonate of lime, a trace of fluoride of calcium, phosphate of magnesium, and other salts. The animal substantia adamantina is the hardest and most compact part of the tooth, and forms a thin crust over the exposed part of the crown, as far as the commencement of the root. It is thickest on the grinding surface of the crown, until worn away by attrition, and becomes thinner toward the neck. It consists of minute hexagonal rods in columns termed enameled fibers or enamel prisms, prismata adamantina. They lie parallel with one another, resting by one extremity upon the dentin, which presents a number of minute depressions for their reception, and forming the free surface of the crown by the other extremity. The columns are directed vertically on the summit of the crown, horizontally at the sides. They are about 4 mm in diameter and pursue a more or less wavy course. In each column is a six-sided prism and presents numerous dark transverse shadings. These shadings are probably due to the manner in which the columns are developed in successive stages, producing shallow contritions, as will be subsequently explained. Another series of lines having a brown appearance, the parallel striae, or colored lines of Retzius, is seen on section. According to Ebner, they are produced by air in the interprismatic spaces. Others believe that they are the result of true pigmentation. Numerous minute interstices intervene between the animal fibers near the dentinal ends, a provision calculated to allow of the permeation of fluids from the dental caniculi into the substance of the animal. Chemical composition. According to von Bibra, animal consists of 96.5% of earthy matter and 3.5% of animal matter. The earthy matter consists of phosphate of lime, with traces of fluoride of calcium, carbonate of lime, phosphate of magnesium, and other salts. According to Thoms, the animal contains the merest trace of organic matter. The crusta petrosa or cement, substantia ossea, is disposed as a thin layer on the roots of the teeth, from the termination of the animal to the apex of each root, where it is usually very thick. In structure and chemical composition it resembles bone. It contains sparingly the lacunae and caniculi which characterize true bone. The lacunae placed near the surface receive the caniculi radiating from the side of the lacunae toward the periodontal membrane, and those more deeply placed join with the adjacent dental caniculi. In the thicker portions of the crusta petrosa, the lamellae or Haversian canals peculiar to bone are also found. As age advances, the cement increases in thickness, and gives rise to those bony growths or exostoses so common in the teeth of the aged. The pulp cavity also becomes partially filled up by a hard substance, intermediate in structure between dentin and bone, osteodentin, Owen, secondary dentin, Thoms. It appears to be formed by a slow conversion of the dental pulp, which shrinks or even disappears. End of section 9. Recording by Ellie, January 2010. Grey's Anatomy Part 5. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ellie. Anatomy of the Human Body Part 5 by Henry Gray. The Mouse Part 3. Development of the teeth. In describing the development of the teeth, the mode of formation of the deciduous teeth must first be considered, and then that of the permanent series. Development of the deciduous teeth. The development of the deciduous teeth begins about the 6th week of fetal life as a thickening of the epithelium along the line of the future jaw, the thickening being due to a rapid multiplication of the more deeply situated epithelial cells. As the cells multiply, they extend into the subjacent mesoderm and thus form a richer strand of cells embedded in mesoderm. About the 7th week, a longitudinal splitting or cleavage of this strand of cells takes place, and it becomes divided into 2 strands. The separation begins in front and extends laterally, the process occupying 4 or 5 weeks. Of the 2 strands thus formed, the labial forms the labiodental lamina, while the other, the lingual, is the ridge of cells in connection with which the teeth, both deciduous and permanent, are developed. Hence it is known as the dental lamina or common dental germ. It forms a flat band of cells, which grows into the substance of the embryonic jaw, at first horizontally inward and then, as the teeth develop, vertically, i.e. upward in the upper jaw and downward in the lower jaw. While still maintaining a horizontal direction, it has 2 edges, an attached edge, continuous with the epithelium lining the mouth, and a free edge, projecting inward and embedded in the mesodermal tissue of the embryonic jaw. Along its line of attachment to the buccal epithelium is a shallow groove, the dental furrow. About the 9th week the dental lamina begins to develop enlargements along its free border. These are 10 in number in each jaw, and each corresponds with a future deciduous tooth. They consist of masses of epithelial cells, and the cells of the deeper part, that is, the part farthest from the margin of the jaw, increase rapidly and spread out in all directions. Each mass thus comes to assume a club shape, connected with the general epithelial lining of the mouth by a narrow neck, embraced by mesoderm. They are now known as special dental germs. After a time the lower expanded portion inclines outward, so as to form an angle with the superficial constricted portion, which is sometimes known as the neck of the special dental germ. About the 10th week the mesodermal tissue beneath the special dental germs becomes differentiated into papillae. These grow upward, and come in contact with the epithelial cells of the special dental germs, which become folded over them like a hood or cap. There is then at this stage a papilla, or papillae, which has already begun to assume somewhat the shape of the crown of the future tooth, and from which the dentin and pulp of the tooth are formed, surmounted by a dome or cap of epithelial cells, from which the enamel is derived. In the meantime, while these changes have been going on, the dental lamina has been extending backward behind the special dental germ corresponding with the second deciduous molar tooth, and at about the 17th week it presents an enlargement, the special dental germ for the first permanent molar, soon followed by the formation of a pillar in the mesodermal tissue for the same tooth. This is followed about the 6th month after birth by a further extension backward of the dental lamina, with the formation of another enlargement and its corresponding papilla for the second molar. And finally the process is repeated for a third time, its papilla appearing about the 5th year of life. After the formation of the special dental germs, the dental lamina undergoes atrophic changes and becomes cribriform except on the lingual and lateral aspects of each of the special dental germs. After the formation of the special dental germs, the dental lamina undergoes atrophic changes and becomes cribriform, except on the lingual and lateral aspects of each of the special germs of the temporary teeth, where it undergoes a local thickening forming the special dental germ of each of the successional permanent teeth, the 10 anterior ones in each jaw. Here the same process goes on as has been described in connection with those of the deciduous teeth. That is, they recede into the substance of the gum behind the germs of the deciduous teeth. As they recede they become club-shaped, form expansions at their distal extremities, and finally meet papillae, which have been formed in the mesoderm just in the same manner as was the case in the deciduous teeth. The apex of each papilla indents the dental germ which encloses it, and forming a cap for it, becomes converted into enamel, while the papilla forms the dentin and pulp of the permanent tooth. The special dental germs consist at first of rounded or polyhedral epithelial cells. After the formation of the papillae, these cells undergo a differentiation into 3 layers. Those which are in immediate contact with the papilla become elongated, and form a layer of well-marked columnar epithelium coating the papilla. They are the cells which form the enamel fibers, and are therefore termed enamel cells or adamantoplasts. The cells of the outer layer of the special dental germs, which are in contact with the inner surface of the dental sac, presently to be described, are much shorter, cubical in form, and are named the external enamel epithelium. All the intermediate round cells of the dental germ between these 2 layers undergo a peculiar change. They become stellate in shape and develop processes, which unite to form a network into which fluid is secreted. This has the appearance of a jelly, and to it the name enamel pulp is given. This transformed special dental germ is now known under the name of enamel organ. While these changes are going on, a sac is formed around each enamel organ from the surrounding mesodermal tissue. This is known as the dental sac, and is a vascular membrane of connective tissue. It grows up from below and thus encloses the whole tooth germ. As it grows, it causes the neck of the enamel organ to atrophy and disappear, so that all communication between the enamel organ and the superficial epithelium is cut off. At this stage there are vascular papillae, surmounted by caps of epithelial cells, the whole being surrounded by membranous sacs. Formation of enamel. The enamel is formed exclusively from the enamel cells or adamantoplasts of the special dental germs, either by direct calcification of the columnar cells, which become elongated into hexagonal rods of the enamel, or, as is more generally believed, as a secretion from the adamantoplasts, within which calcareous matter is subsequently deposited. The process begins at the apex of each cusp, at the ends of the enamel cells in contact with the dental papilla. Here a fine globular deposit takes place, being apparently shed from the end of the adamantoplasts. It is known by the name of enamel droplet, and resembles keratin in its resistance to the action of mineral acids. This droplet then becomes fibrous and calcifies, and forms the first layer of the enamel. A second droplet now appears and calcifies, and so on. Successive droplets of keratin-like material are shed from the adamantoplasts, and form successive layers of enamel, the adamantoplasts gradually receding as each layer is produced, until at the termination of the process they have almost disappeared. The intermediate cells of the animal pulp atrophy and disappear, so that the newly formed calcified material and the external animal epithelium come into opposition. This latter layer, however, soon disappears on the emergence of the tooth beyond the gum. After its disappearance the crown of the tooth is still covered by a distinct membrane, which persists for some time. This is known as the cuticular dentis, or Nasmyth's membrane, and is believed to be the last formed layer of animal derived from the odontoblasts, which has not yet become calcified. It forms a horny layer, which may be separated from the subjacent calcified mass by the action of strong acids. It is marked by the hexagonal impressions of the enamel prisms, and when stained by nitrate of silver shows the characteristic appearance of epithelium. Formation of dentin. While these changes are taking place in the epithelium to form the enamel, contemporaneous changes occurring in the differentiated mesoderm of the dental papillae result in the formation of the dentin. As before stated, the first germs of the dentin are the papillae, corresponding in number to the teeth, formed from the soft mesodermal tissue, which bounds the depressions containing the special enamel germs. The papillae grow upward into the enamel germs and become covered by them, both being enclosed in a vascular connective tissue, the dental sac, in the manner above described. Each papilla then constitutes the formative pulp, from which the dentin and permanent pulp are developed. It consists of rounded cells and is very vascular, and soon begins to assume the shape of a future tooth. The next step is the appearance of the odontoblasts, which have a relation to the development of the teeth similar to that of the osteoblasts to the formation of the bone. They are formed from the cells of the periphery of the papilla, that is to say, from the cells in immediate contact with the odontoblasts of the special dental germ. These cells become elongated, one end of the elongated cell resting against the epithelium of the special dental germs, the other being tapered and often branched. By the direct transformation of the peripheral ends of these cells, or by a secretion from them, a layer of uncalcified matrix prodentin is formed, which caps the cusp, or cusps, if there are more than one, of the papillae. This matrix becomes fibrillated, and in it islets of calcification make their appearance, and coalescing gives rise to a continuous layer of calcified material which covers each cusp and constitutes the first layer of dentin. The odontoblasts, having thus formed the first layer, retire toward the center of the papilla, and as they do so, produce successive layers of dentin from the peripheral extremities. That is to say, they form the dental matrix in which calcification subsequently takes place. As they thus recede from the periphery of the papilla, they leave behind them filamentous processes of cell protoplasm, provided with finer side processes. These are surrounded by calcified material, and thus form the dental caniculi, and by their side branches and anastomosing caniculi, the processes of protoplasm contained within them constitute the dental fibers, Tome's fibers. In this way the entire thickness of the dentin is developed, each caniculus being completed throughout its whole length by a single odontoblast. The central part of the papilla does not undergo calcification, but persists as the pulp of the tooth. In this process of formation of dentin, it has been shown that an uncalcified matrix is first developed, and that in this matrix islets of calcifications appear, which subsequently blend together to form a cap to each cusp. In like manner successive layers are produced, which ultimately become blended with each other. In certain places this blending is not complete. Portions of matrix remain uncalcified between the successive layers. This gives rise to little spaces, which are the interglobular spaces alluded to above. Formation of the cement. The root of the tooth begins to be formed shortly before the crown emerges through the gum, but is not completed until some time afterward. It is produced by a downgrowth of the epithelium of the dental germ, which extends almost as far as the situation of the apex of the future root, and determines the form of this portion of the tooth. This fold of epithelium is known as the epithelial sheath, and on its papillary surface odontoblasts appear, which in turn form dentin, so that the dentin formation is identical in the crown and root of the tooth. After the dentin of the root has been developed, the vascular tissues of the dental sac begin to break through the epithelial sheath and spread over the surface of the root as a layer of bone-forming material. In this osteoblasts make their appearance, and the process of ossification goes on in identically the same manner as in the ordinary intramembranous ossification of bone. In this way the cement is formed. It consists of ordinary bone containing caniculi and lacunae. Formation of the alveoli. About the 14th week of embryonic life the dental lamina becomes enclosed in a rogor groove of mesodermal tissue, which is at first common to all the dental germs, but subsequently becomes divided by bony septa into loculi, each loculus containing a special dental germ of a deciduous tooth and its corresponding permanent tooth. After birth each cavity becomes subdivided so as to form separate loculi, the future alveoli, for the deciduous tooth and its corresponding permanent tooth. Although at one time the whole of the growing tooth is contained in the cavity of the alveolus, the latter never completely encloses it, since there is always an aperture over the top of the crown filled by soft tissue, by which the dental sac is connected with the surface of the gum, and which the permanent teeth is called the gubernaculum dentis. Development of the permanent teeth. The permanent teeth as regards their development may be divided into two sets. First, those which replace the deciduous teeth, and which, like them, are 10 in number in each jaw. These are the successional permanent teeth. And second, those which have no deciduous predecessors, but are superadded distal to the temporary dental series. These are 3 in number on either side of each jaw, and are termed superadded permanent teeth. They are the 3 molars of the permanent set, the molars of the deciduous set being replaced by the premolars of the permanent set. The development of the successional permanent teeth, the 10 anterior ones in either jaw, has already been indicated. During their development the permanent teeth, enclosed in their sacs, come to be placed on the lingual side of the deciduous teeth, and more distant from the margin of the future gum, and, as already stated, are separated from them by bony partitions. As the crown of the permanent tooth grows, absorption of these bony partitions and of the root of the deciduous tooth takes place, through an agency of osteoclasts, which appear at this time, and finally nothing but the crown of the deciduous tooth remains. This is shed or removed, and the permanent tooth takes its place. The superadded permanent teeth are developed in the manner already described, by extensions backward of the posterior part of the dental lamina in each jaw. Eruption of the teeth. When the calcification of the different tissues of each tooth is sufficiently advanced to enable it to bear the pressure to which it will be afterwards subjected, eruption takes place, the tooth making its way through the gum. The gum is absorbed by the pressure of the crown of the tooth against it, which is itself pressed up by the increasing size of the root. At the same time the septa between the dental sacs ossify, and constitute the alveoli. These firmly embrace the necks of the teeth, and afford them a solid basis of support. The eruption of the deciduous teeth commences about the 7th month after birth, and is completed about the end of the 2nd year, the teeth of the lower jaw preceding those of the upper. The following, according to C.S. Holmes, are the most usual times of eruption: lower central incisors, 6 to 9 months; upper incisors, 8 to 10 months; lower lateral incisors and first molars, 15 to 21 months; canines, 16 to 20 months; second molars, 20 to 24 months. There are, however, considerable variations in these times. Thus, according to Holt, at the age of 1 year a child should have 6 teeth; at the age of 2½ years a child should have 12 teeth; at the age of 2 years a child should have 16 teeth; at the age of 2½ years a child should have 20 teeth. Calcification of the permanent teeth proceeds in the following order in the lower jaw. In the upper jaw it takes place a little later. The first molar, soon after birth; the central and lateral incisors and the canine about 6 months after birth; the premolars at the 2nd year, or a little later; the second molar about the end of the 2nd year; the third molar about the 12th year. The eruption of the permanent teeth takes place at the following periods, the teeth of the lower jaw preceding those of the upper with short intervals: first molars, 6th year; 2 central incisors, 7th year; 2 lateral incisors, 8th year; first premolars, 9th year; second premolars, 10th year; canines, 11th to 12th year; second molars, 12th to 13th year; third molars, 17th to 25th year. Toward the 6th year, before the shedding of the deciduous teeth begins, there are 24 teeth in each jaw, the 10 deciduous teeth and the crowns of all permanent teeth, except the third molars. End of section 10. Recording by Ellie, February 2010. Of Grey's Anatomy Part 5. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Recording by Ellie. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 5, by Henry Gray. The Mouse, Part 4. The tongue, lingua. The tongue is the principal organ of the sense of taste, and an important organ of speech. It also assists in the mastication and agglutination of the food. It is situated in the floor of the mouth, within the curve of the body of the mandible. Its root, radix linguae base, is directed backward, and connected with the hyoid bone by the hypoglossy and genioglottal muscles and the hypoglossal membrane, with the epiglottis by 3 folds, glossoepiglottic, of mucous membrane, with the soft palate by the glossopalatine arches, and with the pharynx by the constrictores pharyngis superioris and the mucous membrane. Its apex linguae, tip, thin and narrow, is directed forward against the lingual surfaces of the lower incisor teeth. Its inferior surface, facies inferior linguae, under surface, is connected with the mandible by the genioglossi. The mucous membrane is reflected from it to the lingual surface of the gum and on the floor of the mouth, where, in the middle line, it is elevated into a distinct vertical fold, the frenulum linguae. On either side lateral to the frenulum is a slight fold of the mucous membrane, the plica fibrillata, the free edge of which occasionally exhibits a series of fringe-like processes. The apex of the tongue, the inferior surface, the sides and dorsum are free. The dorsum of the tongue, dorsum linguae, is convex and marked by a median sulcus, which divides it into symmetrical halves. This sulcus ends behind, about 2.5 centimeters from the root of the organ, in a depression, the foramen caecum, from which a shallow groove, the sulcus terminalis, runs lateralward and forward on either side to the margin of the tongue. The part of the dorsum of the tongue in front of its groove, forming about 2/3 of its surface, looks upward, and is rough and covered with papillae. The posterior third looks backward and is smoother, and contains numerous muciparous glands and lymph follicles, lingual tonsil. The foramen caecum is the remains of the upper part of the thyreoglossal duct, or diverticulum, from which the thyroid gland is developed. The pyramidal lobe of the thyroid gland indicates the position of the lower part of the duct. The papillae of the tongue are projections of the corium. They are thickly distributed over the anterior 2/3 of its dorsum, giving to this surface its characteristic roughness. The varieties of papillae matvis are the papillae valate, papillae fungiformes, papillae filiformes, and papillae simplices. The papillae valate, circumvallate papillae, are of a large size, and vary from 8 to 12 in number. They are situated at the dorsum of the tongue, immediately in front of the foramen caecum and sulcus terminalis, forming a row on either side. The 2 rows run backward and medialward, and meet in the middle line, like the limbs of the letter V inverted. Each papilla consists of a projection of mucous membrane from 1 to 2 millimeters wide, attached to the bottom of a circular depression of the mucous membrane. The margin of the depression is elevated from a wall, vallum, and between this and the papilla is a circular sulcus, termed the fossa. The papilla is shaped like a truncated cone, the smaller end being directed downward and attached to the tongue, the broader part or base projecting a little above the surface of the tongue, and being studded with numerous small secondary papillae, and covered with stratified squamous epithelium. The papillae fungiformes, fungiform papillae, more numerous than the preceding, are found chiefly at the sides and apex. They are scattered irregularly and sparingly over the dorsum. They are easily recognized among the other papillae by their large size, rounded eminences, and deep red color. They are narrow at their attachment to the tongue, but broad and rounded at their free extremities, and covered with secondary papillae. The papillae filiformes, filiform or conical papillae, cover the anterior 2/3 of the dorsum. They are very minute, filiform in shape, and arranged in lines parallel with the 2 rows of the papillae valate, excepting at the apex of the organ, where the direction is transverse. Projecting from the apices are numerous filamentous processes, or secondary papillae. These are the whitish tint, owing to the thickness and density of the epithelium of which they are composed, which has here undergone a peculiar modification, the cells having become conified and elongated into dense, imbricated brush-like processes. They contain also a number of elastic fibers, which render them firmer and more elastic than the papillae of mucous membrane generally. The larger and longer papillae of this group are sometimes termed Papillae conicae. The papillae simplices are similar to those of the skin, and cover the whole of the mucous membrane of the tongue, as well as the larger papillae. They consist of closely set microscopic elevations of the corneum, each containing a capillary loop, covered by a layer of epithelium. Muscles of the tongue. The tongue is divided into lateral halves by a medium fibrous septum, which extends throughout its entire length and is fixed below to the hyoid bone. In either half there are two sets of muscles, extrinsic and intrinsic, the former having their origins outside the tongue, the latter are contained entirely within it. The extrinsic muscles are genioglossus, hyoglossus, chondroglossus, styloglossus, glossopalatinus. Footnote 160. The glossopalatinus, palatoglossus, although one of the muscles of the tongue, is more closely associated with the soft palate both in situation and function. It has consequently been described as the muscles of that structure. End of footnote. The genioglossus. Geniohyoglossus is a flat triangular muscle close to and parallel with the median plane, its apex corresponding with its point of origin from the mandible, its base with its insertion into the tongue and hyoid bone. It arises by a sort of tendon from the superior mental spine on the inner surface of the symphysis menti, immediately above the geniohyoideus, and from this point spreads out in a fan-like form. The inferior fibers extend backward to be attached by thin aponeurosis to the upper part of the body of the hyoid bone, a few passing between the hyoglossus and chondroglossus to blend with the constrictores pharyngeis. The middle fibers pass backward, and the superior ones upward and forward, to enter the whole length of the under surface of the tongue, from the root to the apex. The muscles of opposite sides are separated at their insertions by the median fibrous septum of the tongue. In front they are more or less blended owing to the decussation of fasciculi in the median plane. The hyoglossus, thin and quadrilateral, arises from the side of the body and from the whole length of the greater cornu of the hyoid bone, and passes almost vertically upward to enter the side of the tongue between the styloglossus and longitudinalis inferior. The fibers arising from the body of the hyoid bone overlap those of the greater cornu. The chondroglossus is sometimes described as part of the hyoglossus, but is separated from it by fibers of the genioglossus, which passes to the side of the pharynx. It is about 2 centimeters long, and arises from the medial side and base of the lesser cornu and contiguous portion of the body of the hyoid bone, and passes directly upward to blend with the intrinsic muscular fibers of the tongue between the hyoglossus and genioglossus. A small slip of muscular fibers is occasionally found, arising from the cartilago trapezius and the lateral hyothyroid ligament, and entering the tongue with the hindermost fibers of the hyoglossus. The styloglossus, the shortest and smallest of the 3 styloid muscles, arises from the anterior and lateral surfaces of the styloid process, near its apex, and from the stylomandibular ligament. Passing downward and forward between the internal and external carotid arteries, it divides upon the side of the tongue near its dorsal surface, blending with the fibers of the longitudinalis inferior in front of the hyoglossus. The other oblique overlaps the hyoglossus and decussets with its fibers. The intrinsic muscles are longitudinalis superior, transversus, longitudinalis inferior, verticalis. The longitudinalis linguae superior, superior lingualis, is a thin stratum of oblique and longitudinal fibers, immediately underlying the mucous membrane on the dorsum of the tongue. It arises from a submucous fibrous layer close to the epiglottis, and from the median fibrous septum, and runs forward to the edges of the tongue. The longitudinalis linguae inferior, inferior lingualis, is a narrow band situated on the under surface of the tongue between the genioglossus and hyoglossus. It extends from the root to the apex of the tongue. Behind, some of its fibers are connected with the body of the hyoid bone. In front it blends with the fibers of the styloglossus. The transversus linguae, transverse lingualis, consists of fibers which arise from the median fibrous septum and pass lateralward to be inserted into the submucous fibrous tissue at the sides of the tongue. The verticalis linguae, vertical lingualis, is found only at the borders of the forepart of the tongue. Its fibers extend from the upper to the under surface of the organ. The median fibrous septum of the tongue is very complete, so that the anastomosis between the 2 lingual arteries is not very free. Nerves. The muscles of the tongue described above are supplied by the hyoglossal nerve. Actions. The movements of the tongue, although numerous and complicated, may be understood by carefully considering the direction of the fibres of its muscles. The genioglossi, by means of their posterior fibres, draw the root of the tongue forward, and protrude the apex from the mouth. The anterior fibres draw the tongue back into the mouth. The anterior fibres draw the tongue back into the mouth. The two muscles acting in their entirety draw the tongue downward, so as to make its superior surface concave from side to side, forming a canal along which fluids may pass toward the pharynx, as in sucking. The hyoglossi depress the tongue, and draw down its sides. The styloglossi draw the tongue upward and backward. The glossopalatini draw the root of the tongue upward. The intrinsic muscles are mainly concerned in alternating the shape of the tongue, whereby it becomes shortened, narrowed, or curved in different portions. Thus the longitudinally superior and inferior tend to shorten the tongue, but the former in addition turn the tip and sides upward so as to render the dorsum concave, while the latter pull the tip downward and render the dorsum convex. The transversus narrows and elongates the tongue, and the verticalis flattens and broadens it. The complex arrangement of the muscular fibres of the tongue and the various directions in which they run give this organ the power of assuming the forms necessary for the enunciation of the different consonantal sounds. And Macalister states, there is reason to believe that the musculature of the tongue varies in different races, owing to the hereditary practice and habitual use of certain motions required for enunciating the several vernacular languages. Structure of the tongue. The tongue is partly invested by mucous membrane and a submucous fibrous layer. The mucous membrane, tunica mucosa linguae, differs in different parts. That covering the under surface of the origin is thin, smooth, and identical in structure with that lining the rest of the oral cavity. The mucous membrane of the dorsum of the tongue, behind the foramen caecum and sulcus terminalis, is thick and freely movable over the subjacent parts. It contains a large number of lymphoid follicles, which together constitute what is sometimes termed the lingual tonsil. Each follicle forms a rounded eminence, the center of which is perforated by a minute orifice leading into a funnel-shaped cavity or recess. Around this recess are grouped numerous oval or rounded nodules of lymphoid tissue, each enveloped by a capsule derived from the submucosa, while opening into the bottom of the recess are also seen the ducts of mucous glands. The mucous membrane on the anterior part of the dorsum of the tongue is thin, immediately adherent to the muscular tissue, and presents numerous minute surface eminences, the papillae of the tongue. It consists of a layer of connective tissue, the corneum or mucosa, covered with epithelium. The epithelium is of the stratified squamous variety, similar to but much thinner than that of the skin, and each papilla has a separate investment from root to summit. The deepest cells may sometimes be attached as a separate layer, corresponding to the red mucosum, but they never contain colouring matter. The chorium consists of a dense feltwork of fibrous connective tissue, with numerous elastic fibres firmly connected with the fibrous tissue forming the septa between the muscular bundles of the tongue. It contains the ramifications of the numerous vessels and nerves from which the papillae are supplied, large plexuses of lymphatic vessels, and the glands of the tongue. Structure of the papillae. The papillae apparently resemble in structure those of the cutis, consisting of cone-shaped projections of connective tissue, covered with a thick layer of stratified squamous epithelium, and containing one or more capillary loops, among which nerves are distributed in great abundance. If the epithelium be removed, it will be found that they are not simple elevations like the papillae of the skin, for the surface of each is studded with a minute conical process, which forms secondary papillae. In the papillae velatae, the nerves are numerous and of a large size. In the papillae fungiformis they are also numerous, and end in a plexiform network, from which brush-like branches proceed. In the papillae filiformis, the mode of termination is uncertain. Glands of the tongue. The tongue is provided with mucous and serous glands. The mucous glands are similar in structure to the labial and buccal glands. They are found especially at the back part behind the valid papillae, but they are also present at the apex and marginal parts. In this connection the anterior lingual glands, blenden or nun, require special notice. They are situated on the under surface of the apex of the tongue, one on either side of the frenulum, where they are covered by fasciculars of muscular fibres derived from the styloglossus and longitudinalis inferior. They are from 12 to 25 millimeters long and about 8 millimeters broad, and each opens by 3 or 4 ducts on the under surface of the apex. The serous glands occur only in the back of the tongue in the neighborhood of the taste buds, the ducts opening for the most part into the fauces of the valid papillae. These glands are racemose, the duct of each branching into several minute ducts, which end in alveoli, lined by a single layer of more or less columnar epithelium. Their secretion is of a watery nature, and probably assists in the distribution of the substance to be tasted over the taste area (Ebner). The septum. The septum consists of a vertical layer of fibrous tissue, extending throughout the entire length of the median plane of the tongue, though not quite reaching the dorsum. It is thicker behind than in front, and occasionally contains a small fibrocartilage about 6 millimeters in length. It is well displayed by making a vertical section across the organ. The hypoglossal membrane is a strong fibrous lamina, which connects the under surface of the root of the tongue to the body of the hyoid bone. This membrane receives in front some of the fibers of the genioglossi. Taste buds, the end organs of the gustatory sense, are scattered over the mucous membrane of the mouth and tongue at irregular intervals. They occur especially in the sides of the valid papillae. In the rabbit there is a localized area at the side of the base of the tongue, the papillae foliata, in which they are especially abundant. They are described under the organs of the senses. Vessels and nerves. The main artery of the tongue is the lingual branch of the external carotid, but the external maxillary and descending pharyngeal also give branches to it. The veins open into the internal jugular. The lymphatics of the tongue have been described on page 696. The sensory nerves of the tongue are: 1. The lingual branch of the mandibula, which is distributed to the papillae at the forepart and sides of the tongue, and forms the nerve of ordinary sensibility for its interior 2/3. 2. The chordotympani branch of the facial, which runs in the sheath of the lingual and is generally regarded as the nerve of taste for the interior 2/3. This nerve is a continuation of the sensory root of the facial, nervus intermedius. 3. The lingual branch of the glossopharyngeal, which is distributed to the mucous membrane at the base and sides of the tongue, and to the papillae velate, and which supplies both gustatory filaments and fibers of general sensation to this region. 4. The superior laryngeal, which sends some fine branches to the root near the epiglottis. End of section 11. Recording by Ellie, February 2010. Of Grey's Anatomy Part 5. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Ellie. Anatomy of the Human Body Part 5 by Henry Gray. The Mouse Part 5. The salivary glands. 3 large pairs of salivary glands communicate with the mouth and pour the secretion into its cavity. They are the parotid, submaxillary, and sublingual. Parotid gland, glandula parotis. The parotid gland, the largest of the 3, varies in weight from 14 to 28 grams. It lies upon the side of the face, immediately below and in front of the external ear. The main portion of the gland is superficial, somewhat flattened and quadrilateral in form, and is placed between the ramus of the mandible in front and the mastoid process and sternocleidomastoideus behind, overlapping, however, both boundaries. Above, it is broad and reaches nearly to the zygomatic arch. Below, it tapers somewhat to about the level of a line joining to the tip of the mastoid process to the angle of the mandible. The remainder of the gland is irregularly wedge-shaped and extends deeply inward toward the pharyngeal wall. The gland is enclosed within a capsule, continuous with the deep cervical fascia. The layer covering the superficial surface is dense and closely adherent to the gland. A portion of the fascia attached to the styloid process and the angle of the mandible is thickened to form the stylomandibular ligament, which intervenes between the parotid and the submaxillary glands. The anterior surface of the gland is molded on the posterior border of the ramus of the mandible, closed by the pterygoideus internus and masseter. The inner lip of the groove dips for a short distance between the 2 pterygoid muscles, while the outer lip extends for some distance over the superficial surface of the masseter. A small portion of this lip, immediately below the zygomatic arch, is usually detached, and is named the accessory part, socioparotidis, of the gland. The posterior surface is grooved longitudinally and abuts against the external acoustic meatus, the mastoid process, and the anterior border of the sternocleidomastoideus. The superficial surface, slightly lobulated, is covered by integument, the superficial fascia containing the facial branches of the great auricular nerve and some small lymph glands, and the fascia which forms the capsule of the gland. The deep surface extends inward by means of two processes, one of which lies under the gastricus, styloid process, and the styloid group of muscles, and projects under the mastoid process and sternocleidomastoideus. The other is situated in front of the styloid process, and sometimes passes into the posterior part of the mandibular fossa, behind the temporomandibular joint. The deep surface is in contact with the internal and external carotid arteries, the internal jugular vein, and the vagus and glossopharyngeal nerves. The gland is separated from the pharyngeal wall by some loose connective tissue. Structures within the gland. The external carotid artery lies at first on the deep surface, and then in the substance of the gland. The artery gives off its posterior auricular branch, which emerges from the gland behind. It then divides into its terminal branches, the internal maxillary and the superficial temporal. The former runs forward deep to the neck of the mandible. The latter runs upward across the zygomatic arch and gives off its transverse facial branch, which emerges from the front of the gland. Superficial to the arteries are the superficial temporal and internal maxillary veins, uniting to form the posterior facial vein. In the lower part of the gland this vein splits into anterior and posterior divisions. The anterior division emerges from the gland and unites with the anterior facial to form the common facial vein. The posterior unites in the gland with the posterior auricular to form the external jugular vein. On a still more superficial plane is the facial nerve, the branches of which emerge from the borders of the gland. Branches of the great auricular nerve pierce the gland to join the facial, while the auricular temporal nerve issues from the upper part of the gland. The parotid duct, ductus parotideus, Stenson's duct, is about 7 centimeters long. It begins by numerous branches from the anterior part of the gland, crosses the masseter, and at the anterior border of this muscle turns inward nearly at the right angle, passes through the corpus adiposum of the cheek, and pierces the buccinator. It then runs for a short distance obliquely forward between the buccinator and mucous membrane of the mouth, and opens upon the oral surface of the cheek by a small orifice, opposite the second upper molar tooth. While crossing the masseter, it receives the duct of the accessory portion. In this position it lies between the branches of the facial nerve. The accessory part of the gland and the transverse facial artery are above it. Structure. The parotid duct is dense, its wall being of considerable thickness. Its canal is about the size of a crow quill, but at its orifice on the oral surface of the cheek its lumen is greatly reduced in size. It consists of a thick external fibrous coat, which contains contractile fibers, and of an internal or mucous coat, lined with a short columnar epithelium. Vessels and nerves. The arteries supplying the parotid gland are derived from the external carotid, and from the branches given off by that vessel, in or near its substance. The veins empty themselves into the external jugular, through some of its tributaries. The lymphatics end in the superficial and deep cervical lymph glands, passing in their course through 2 or 3 glands, placed on the surface and in the substance of the parotid. The nerves are derived from the plexus of the sympathetic on the external carotid artery, the facial, the auriculotemporal, and the great auricular nerves. It is probable that the branch from the auriculotemporal nerve is derived from the glossopharyngeal through the otic ganglion. At all events, in some of the lower animals, this has been proved experimentally to be the case. Submaxillary gland, glandula submaxillaris. The submaxillary gland is irregular in form and about the size of a walnut. A considerable part of it is situated in the submaxillary triangle, reaching forward to the anterior belly of the digastricus and backward to the stylomandibular ligament, which intervenes between it and the parotid gland. Above, it extends under the cover of the body of the mandible. Below, it usually overlaps the intermediate tendon of the digastricus and the insertion of the stylohyoideus, while from its deep surface a tongue-like deep process extends forward above the mylohyoideus muscle. Its superficial surface consists of an upper and a lower part. The upper part is directed outward, and lies partly against the submaxillary depression on the inner surface of the body of the mandible, and partly on the pterygoideus internus. The lower part is directed downward and outward, and is covered by the skin, superficial fascia, platysma, and deep cervical fascia. It is crossed by the anterior facial vein and by filaments of the facial nerve. In contact with it near the mandible are the submaxillary lymph glands. The deep surface is in relation with the mylohyoideus, hypoglossus, styloglossus, stylohyoideus, and posterior belly of the digastricus. In contact with it are the mylohyoid nerve, the mylohyoid and submental vessels. The external maxillary artery is embedded in a groove in the posterior border of the gland. The deep process of the gland extends forward between the mylohyoideus below and externally, and the hyoglossus and styloglossus internally. Above it is the lingual nerve and submaxillary ganglion. Below it the hyoglossal nerve and its accompanying vein. The submaxillary duct, ductus submaxillaris, Wharton's duct, is about 5 centimeters long, and its wall is much thinner than that of the parotid duct. It begins by numerous branches from the deep surface of the gland, and runs forward between the mylohyoideus and hyoglossus and genioglossus, then between the sublingual gland and the genioglossus, and opens by a narrow orifice on the summit of a small papilla at the side of the frenulum linguae. On the hyoglossus it lies between the lingual and hyoglossal nerves, but at the anterior border of the muscle it is crossed laterally by the lingual nerve. The terminal branches of the lingual nerve ascend on its medial side. Vessels and nerves. The arteries supplying the submaxillary gland are branches of the external maxillary and lingual. Its veins follow the course of the arteries. The nerves are derived from the submaxillary ganglion, through which it receives filaments from the chorda tympani of the facial nerve and the lingual branch of the mandibular, sometimes from the mylohyoid branch of the inferior alveolar, and from the sympathetic. Sublingual gland, glandula sublingualis. The sublingual gland is the smallest of the 3 glands. It is situated beneath the mucous membrane of the floor of the mouth, at the side of the frenulum linguae, in contact with the sublingual depression on the inner surface of the mandible, close to the symphysis. It is narrow, flattened, shaped somewhat like an almond, and weighs only 2 grams. It is in relation above with the mucous membrane, below with the mylohyoideus, behind with the deep part of the submaxillary gland, laterally with the mandible, and medially with the genioglossus, from which it is separated by the lingual nerve and the submaxillary duct. Its excretory ducts are from 8 to 20 in number. Of the smaller sublingual ducts, ducts of Rivinus, some join the submaxillary duct. Others open separately into the mouth, on the elevated crest of the mucous membrane, plica sublingualis, caused by the projection of the gland on either side of the frenulum linguae. One or more join to form the larger sublingual duct, duct of Bartholin, which opens into the submaxillary duct. Vessels and nerves. The sublingual gland is supplied with blood from the sublingual and submental arteries. Its nerves are derived from the lingual, the chorda tympani, and the sympathetic. Structure of the salivary glands. The salivary glands are compound racemose glands, consisting of numerous lobes, which are made up of smaller lobules, connected together by dense areolar tissue, vessels and ducts. Each lobule consists of the ramifications of a single duct, the branches ending in dilated ends, or alveoli, on which the capillaries are distributed. The alveoli are enclosed by a basement membrane, which is continuous with the membrana propria of the duct, and consists of a network of branched and flattened nucleated cells. The alveoli of the salivary glands are of 2 kinds, which differ in appearance of the secreting cells, in their size, and in the nature of their secretion. 1. The mucous variety secretes a viscid fluid, which contains mucin. 2. The serose variety secretes a thinner and more watery fluid. The sublingual gland consists of mucus, the parotid of serose alveoli. The submaxillary contains both mucus and serose alveoli, the latter, however, preponderating. The cells in the mucous alveoli are columnar in shape. In the fresh condition they contain large granules of mucinogen. In hardened preparations a delicate protoplasmic network is seen, and the cells are clear and transparent. The nucleus is usually situated near the basement membrane and is flattened. In some alveoli are seen peculiar crescentic bodies, lying between the cells and the membrana propria. They are termed the crescents of Janussi, or the demilune of Heidenhain. and are composed of polyhedral granular cells, which Heidenhain regards as young epithelial cells, destined to supply the place of those salivary cells which have undergone disintegration. This view, however, is not accepted by Klein. Fine canaliculi pass between the mucus-secreting cells to reach the demilune and even penetrate the cells forming these structures. In the serose alveoli, the cells almost completely fill the cavity, so that there is hardly any lumen perceptible. They contain secretory granules embedded in a closely reticulated protoplasm. The cells are more cubical than those of the mucus type. The nucleus of each is spherical and placed near the center of the cell. The granules are smaller. Both mucus and serous cells vary in appearance according to whether the gland is in resting condition or has recently been active. In the former case the cells are large and contain many secretory granules. In the latter case they are shrunken and contain few granules, chiefly collected at the inner ends of the cells. The granules are best seen in fresh preparations. The ducts are lined at the origins by epithelium, which differs little from the pavement form. As the ducts enlarge, the epithelial cells change to the columnar shape, and the part of the cell next the basement membrane is finally striated. The lobules of the salivary glands are richly supplied with blood vessels, which form a dense network in the interalveolar spaces. Fine plexuses of nerves are also found in the interlobular tissue. The nerve fibrils pierce the basement membrane of the alveoli and end in branched varicose filaments between the secreting cells. In the hilus of the submaxillary gland there is a collection of nerve cells, termed Langley's ganglion. Accessory glands. Besides the salivary glands proper, numerous other glands are found in the mouth. Many of these glands are found in the posterior part of the dorsum of the tongue, behind the valid papillae, and also along its margin as far forward as the apex. Others lie around, and in the palatine tonsil between its crypts, and large numbers are present in the soft palate, the lips and cheeks. These glands are of the same structure as the larger salivary glands, and they are of a mucous or mixed type. End of section 12. Recording by Ellie, February 2010.
Section 13 of Gray's Anatomy, Part 5. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 5, by Henry Gray. The fauces. 2b. The fauces. The aperture by which the mouth communicates with the pharynx is called the isthmus faucium. It is bounded above by the soft palate, below by the dorsum of the tongue, and on either side by the glossopalatine arch. The glossopalatine arch, arcus glossopalatinus, anterior pillar of fauces, on either side runs downward, lateralward, and forward to the side of the base of the tongue, and is formed by the projection of the glossopalatinus with its covering mucous membrane. The pharyngopalatine arch, arcus pharyngopalatinus, posterior pillar of fauces, is larger and projects farther toward the middle line than the anterior. It runs downward, lateralward, and backward to the side of the pharynx, and is formed by the projection of the pharyngopalatinus, covered by mucous membrane. On either side the two arches are separated below by a triangular interval in which the palatine tonsil is lodged. The palatine tonsils, tonsili palatini tonsil, are two prominent masses situated one on either side between the glossopalatine and pharyngopalatine arches. Each tonsil consists fundamentally of an aggregation of lymphoid tissue underlying the mucous membrane between the palatine arches. The lymphoid mass, however, does not completely fill the interval between the two arches, so that a small depression, the supratonsillar fossa, exists at the upper part of the interval. Further, the tonsil extends for a variable distance under cover of the glossopalatine arch, and is here covered by a reduplication of mucous membrane. The upper part of this fold reaches across the supratonsillar fossa, between the two arches, as a thin fold sometimes termed the plica semilunaris. The remainder of the fold is called the plica triangularis. Between the plica triangularis and the surface of the tonsil is a space known as the tonsillar sinus. In many cases, however, this sinus is obliterated by its walls becoming adherent. From this description it will be apparent that a portion of the tonsil is below the level of the surrounding mucous membrane, i.e., is embedded, while the remainder projects as the visible tonsil. In the child the tonsils are relatively, and frequently absolutely, larger than in the adult, and about 1/3 of the tonsil is embedded. After puberty the embedded portion diminishes considerably in size, and the tonsil assumes a disc-like form, flattened from side to side. The shape and size of the tonsil, however, vary considerably in different individuals. The medial surface of the tonsil is free except anteriorly, where it is covered by the plica triangularis. It presents from 12 to 15 orifices leading into small crypts or recesses from which numerous follicles branch out into the tonsillar substance. The lateral or deep surface is adherent to a fibrous capsule, which is continued into the plica triangularis. It is separated from the inner surface of the constrictor pharynges superior, usually by some loose connective tissue. This muscle intervenes between the tonsil and the external maxillary artery with its tonsillar and ascending palatine branches. The internal carotid artery lies behind and lateral to the tonsil, at a distance of 20 to 25 millimeters from it. The tonsils form part of a circular band of adenoid tissue which guards the opening into the digestive and respiratory tubes. The anterior part of the ring is formed by the submucous adenoid collections, lingual tonsil, on the posterior part of the tongue. The lateral portions consist of the palatine tonsils and the adenoid collections in the vicinity of the auditory tubes, while the ring is completed behind the pharyngeal tonsil on the posterior wall of the pharynx. In the intervals between these main masses are smaller collections of adenoid tissue. Structure. The follicles of the tonsil are lined by a continuation of the mucous membrane of the pharynx, covered with stratified squamous epithelium. Around each follicle is a layer of closed capsules consisting of lymphoid tissue embedded in the submucous tissue. Lymph corpuscles are found in large numbers invading the stratified epithelium. It is probable that they pass into the mouth and form the so-called salivary corpuscles. Surrounding each follicle is a close plexus of lymphatics, from which the lymphatic vessels pass to the deep cervical glands in the neighborhood of the greater cornu of the hyoid bone, behind and below the angle of the mandible. Vessels and nerves. The arteries supplying the tonsil are the dorsalis linguae from the lingual, the ascending palatine and tonsillar from the external maxillary, the ascending pharyngeal from the external carotid, the descending palatine branch of the internal maxillary, and a twig from the small meningeal. The veins end in the tonsillar plexus on the lateral side of the tonsil. The nerves are derived from the sphenopalatine ganglion and from the glossopharyngeal. Palatine aponeurosis. Attached to the posterior border of the hard palate is a thin, firm, fibrous lamella, which supports the muscles and gives strength to the soft palate. It is thicker above than below, where it becomes very thin and difficult to define. Laterally it is continuous with the pharyngeal aponeurosis. Muscles of the palate. The muscles of the palate are levator veli palatini, tensor veli palatini, musculus uvuli, glossopalatinus, pharyngopalatinus. The levator veli palatini, levator palati, is a thick, rounded muscle situated lateral to the choanae. It arises from the under surface of the apex of the petrous part of the temporal bone, and from the medial lamina of the cartilage of the auditory tube. After passing above the upper concave margin of the constrictor pharyngeus superior, it spreads out in the palatine velum, its fibers extending obliquely downward and medialward to the middle line, where they blend with those of the opposite side. The tensor veli palatini, tensor palati, is a broad, thin, ribbon-like muscle placed lateral to the levator veli palatini. It arises by a flat lamella from the scaphoid fossa at the base of the medial pterygoid plate, from the spina angularis of the sphenoid, and from the lateral wall of the cartilage of the auditory tube. Descending vertically between the medial pterygoid plate and the pterygoideus internus, it ends in a tendon which winds around the pterygoid hamulus, being retained in this situation by some of the fibers of origin of the pterygoideus internus. Between the tendon and the hamulus is a small bursa. The tendon then passes medialward and is inserted into the palatine aponeurosis and into the surface behind the transverse ridge on the horizontal part of the palatine bone. The musculus uvuli, azygos uvuli, arises from the posterior nasal spine of the palatine bones and from the palatine aponeurosis. It descends to be inserted into the uvula. The glossopalatinus, palatoglossus, is a small, fleshy fasciculus, narrower in the middle than at either end, forming, with the mucous membrane covering its surface, the glossopalatine arch. It arises from the anterior surface of the soft palate, where it is continuous with the muscle of the opposite side, and, passing downward, forward and lateralward in front of the palatine tonsil, is inserted into the side of the tongue, some of its fibers spreading over the dorsum, and others passing deeply into the substance of the organ to intermingle with the transversus linguae. The pharyngopalatinus, palatopharyngeus, is a long, fleshy fasciculus, narrower in the middle than at either end, forming, with the mucous membrane covering its surface, the pharyngopalatine arch. It is separated from the glossopalatinus by an angular interval in which the palatine tonsil is lodged. It arises from the soft palate, where it is divided into two fasciculi by the levator veli palatini and musculus uvuli. The posterior fasciculus lies in contact with the mucous membrane, and joins with that of the opposite muscle in the middle line. The anterior fasciculus, the thicker, lies in the soft palate between the levator and tensor, and joins in the middle line the corresponding part of the opposite muscle. Passing lateralward and downward behind the palatine tonsil, the pharyngopalatinus joins the stylopharyngeus and is inserted with that muscle into the posterior border of the thyroid cartilage, some of its fibers being lost on the side of the pharynx, and others passing across the middle line posteriorly to decussate with the muscle of the opposite side. Nerves. The tensor veli palatini is supplied by a branch from the otic ganglion. The remaining muscles of this group are in all probability supplied by the accessory nerve through the pharyngeal plexus. Actions. During the first stage of deglutition, the bolus of food is driven back into the fauces by the pressure of the tongue against the hard palate, the base of the tongue being, at the same time, retracted, and the larynx raised with the pharynx. During the second stage the entrance to the larynx is closed by the drawing forward of the arytenoid cartilages toward the cushion of the epiglottis, a movement produced by the contraction of the thyroid arytenoidea, the arytenoidea, and the aryteno-epiglottidae. After leaving the tongue, the bolus passes on to the posterior or laryngeal surface of the epiglottis, and glides along this for a certain distance. Then the glossopalatini, the constrictors of the fauces, contract behind it. The palatine velum is slightly raised by the levator veli palatini, and made tense by the tensor veli palatini, and the pharyngopalatini by their contraction, pull the pharynx upward over the bolus, and come nearly together, the uvula filling up the slight interval between them. By these means the food is prevented from passing into the nasal part of the pharynx. At the same time, the pharyngopalatini form an inclined plane, directed obliquely downward and backward, along the under surface of which the bolus descends into the lower part of the pharynx. The salpingopharyngii raise the upper and lateral parts of the pharynx, i.e., those parts which are above the points where the stylopharyngii are attached to the pharynx. Mucous membrane. The mucous membrane of the soft palate is thin, and covered with stratified squamous epithelium on both surfaces, excepting near the pharyngeal ostium of the auditory tube, where it is columnar and ciliated. According to Klein, the mucous membrane on the nasal surface of the soft palate in the fetus is covered throughout by columnar ciliated epithelium, which subsequently becomes squamous. Some anatomists state that it is covered with columnar ciliated epithelium, except at its free margin, throughout life. Beneath the mucous membrane on the oral surface of the soft palate is a considerable amount of adenoid tissue. The palatine glands form a continuous layer on its posterior surface and around the uvula. Vessels and nerves. The arteries supplying the palate are the descending palatine branch of the internal maxillary, the ascending palatine branch of the external maxillary, and the palatine branch of the ascending pharyngeal. The veins end chiefly in the pterygoid and tonsillar plexuses. The lymphatic vessels pass to the deep cervical glands. The sensory nerves are derived from the palatine and nasopalatine nerves and from the glossopharyngeal. End of section 13. Recording by Leanne Howlett. Of Gray's Anatomy, Part 5. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. Anatomy of the Human Body, Part 5, by Henry Gray. The Pharynx. 2c. The Pharynx. The pharynx is that part of the digestive tube which is placed behind the nasal cavities, mouth, and larynx. It is a musculo-membranous tube, somewhat conical in form, with the base upward and the apex downward, extending from the under surface of the skull to the level of the cricoid cartilage in front and that of the sixth cervical vertebra behind. The cavity of the pharynx is about 12.5 centimeters long, and broader in the transverse than in the antero-posterior diameter. Its greatest breadth is immediately below the base of the skull, where it projects on either side, behind the pharyngeal ostium of the auditory tube, as the pharyngeal recess, fossa of Rosenmuller. Its narrowest point is at its termination in the esophagus. It is limited above by the body of the sphenoid and basilar part of the occipital bone. Below, it is continuous with the esophagus. Posteriorly, it is connected by loose areolar tissue with the cervical portion of the vertebral column and the prevertebral fascia covering the longus colli and longus capitis muscles. Anteriorly, it is incomplete, and is attached in succession to the medial pterygoid plate, pterygomandibular raphe, mandible, tongue, hyoid bone, and thyroid and cricoid cartilages. Laterally, it is connected to the styloid processes and their muscles, and is in contact with the common and internal carotid arteries, the internal jugular veins, the glossopharyngeal, vagus, and hypoglossal nerves, and the sympathetic trunks and above with small parts of the pterygoidea interni. 7 cavities communicate with it, viz., the 2 nasal cavities, the 2 tympanic cavities, the mouth, the larynx, and the esophagus. The cavity of the pharynx may be subdivided from above downward into three parts: nasal, oral, and laryngeal. The nasal part of the pharynx, pars nasalis pharyngeus, nasopharynx, lies behind the nose and above the level of the soft palate. It differs from the oral and laryngeal parts of the pharynx in that its cavity always remains patent. In front it communicates through the choana with the nasal cavities. On its lateral wall is the pharyngeal ostium of the auditory tube, somewhat triangular in shape, and bounded behind by a firm prominence, the torus or cushion caused by the medial end of the cartilage of the tube, which elevates the mucous membrane. A vertical fold of mucous membrane, the salpingopharyngeal fold, stretches from the lower part of the torus. It contains the salpingopharyngeus muscle. A second and smaller fold, the salpingopalatine fold, stretches from the upper part of the torus to the palate. Behind the ostium of the auditory tube is a deep recess, the pharyngeal recess, fossa of Rosenmuller. On the posterior wall is a prominence, best marked in childhood, produced by a mass of lymphoid tissue which is known as the pharyngeal tonsil. Above the pharyngeal tonsil, in the middle line, an irregular flask-shaped depression of the mucous membrane sometimes extends up as far as the basilar process of the occipital bone. It is known as the pharyngeal bursa. The oral part of the pharynx, pars oralis pharyngeus, reaches from the soft palate to the level of the hyoid bone. It opens anteriorly, through the isthmus faucium, into the mouth, while in its lateral wall, between the two palatine arches, is the palatine tonsil. The laryngeal part of the pharynx, pars laryngia pharyngeus, reaches from the hyoid bone to the lower part of the cricoid cartilage, where it is continuous with the esophagus. In front it presents the triangular entrance of the larynx, the base of which is directed forward and is formed by the epiglottis, while its lateral boundaries are constituted by the areoepiglottic folds. On either side of the laryngeal orifice is a recess termed the sinus piriformis, which is bounded medially by the areoepiglottic fold, laterally by the thyroid cartilage and hyothyroid membrane. Muscles of the pharynx. The muscles of the pharynx are: constrictor inferior, constrictor medius, constrictor superior, stylopharyngeus, salpingopharyngeus, pharyngopalatinus. Note: the pharyngopalatinus is described with the muscles of the palate. End of note. The constrictor pharyngeus inferior, inferior constrictor, the thickest of the three constrictors, arises from the sides of the cricoid and thyroid cartilage. From the cricoid cartilage it arises in the interval between the cricothyroideus in front and the articular facet for the inferior cornu of the thyroid cartilage behind. On the thyroid cartilage it arises from the oblique line on the side of the lamina, from the surface behind this nearly as far as the posterior border, and from the inferior cornu. From these origins the fibres spread backward and medialward, to be inserted with the muscle of the opposite side into the fibrous raphe in the posterior median line of the pharynx. The inferior fibres are horizontal and continuous with the circular fibres of the esophagus. The rest ascend, increasing in obliquity, and overlap the constrictor medius. The constrictor pharyngeus medius, middle constrictor, is a fan-shaped muscle, smaller than the preceding. It arises from the whole length of the upper border of the greater cornu of the hyoid bone, from the lesser cornu, and from the stylohyoid ligament. The fibres diverge from their origin. The lower ones descend beneath the constrictor inferior, the middle fibres pass transversely, and the upper fibres ascend and overlap the constrictor superior. It is inserted into the posterior median fibrous raphe, blending in the middle line with the muscle of the opposite side. The constrictor pharyngeus superior, superior constrictor, is a quadrilateral muscle, thinner and paler than the other two. It arises from the lower third of the posterior margin of the medial pterygoid plate and its hamillus, from the pterygomandibular raphe, from the alveolar process of the mandible above the posterior end of the mylohyoid line, and by a few fibers from the side of the tongue. The fibers curve backward to be inserted into the median raphe, being also prolonged by means of an aponeurosis to the pharyngeal spine on the basilar part of the occipital bone. The superior fibers arch beneath the levator veli palatini and the auditory tube. The interval between the upper border of the muscle and the base of the skull is closed by the pharyngeal aponeurosis, and is known as the sinus of Morgagni. The stylopharyngeus is a long, slender muscle, cylindrical above, flattened below. It arises from the medial side of the base of the styloid process, passes downward along the side of the pharynx between the constrictors superior and medius, and spreads out beneath the mucous membrane. Some of its fibers are lost in the constrictor muscles, while others, joining with the pharyngo-palatinus, are inserted into the posterior border of the thyroid cartilage. The glossopharyngeal nerve runs on the lateral side of this muscle and crosses over it to reach the tongue. The salpingopharyngeus arises from the inferior part of the auditory tube near its orifice. It passes downward and blends with the posterior fasciculus of the pharyngo-palatinus. Nerves. The constrictors and salpingopharyngeus are supplied by branches from the pharyngeal plexus, the constrictor inferior by additional branches from the external laryngeal and recurrent nerves, and the stylopharyngeus by the glossopharyngeal nerve. Actions. When deglutition is about to be performed, the pharynx is drawn upward and dilated in different directions to receive the food propelled into it from the mouth. The stylopharyngii, which are much farther removed from one another at their origin than at their insertion, draw the sides of the pharynx upward and lateralward, and so increase its transverse diameter. Its breadth in the antero-posterior direction is increased by the larynx and tongue being carried forward in their ascent. As soon as the bolus of food is received in the pharynx, the elevator muscles relax, the pharynx descends, and the constrictors contract upon the bolus and convey it downward into the esophagus. Structure. The pharynx is composed of 3 coats, mucous, fibrous, and muscular. The pharyngeal aponeurosis, or fibrous coat, is situated between the mucous and muscular layers. It is thick above where the muscular fibers are wanting, and is firmly connected to the basilar portion of the occipital and the petrous portions of the temporal bones. As it descends it diminishes in thickness, and is gradually lost. It is strengthened posteriorly by a strong fibrous band, which is attached above to the pharyngeal spine on the under surface of the basilar portion of the occipital bone, and passes downward, forming a median raphe, which gives attachment to the constrictors pharyngeus. The mucous coat is continuous with that lining the auditory tubes, the nasal cavities, the mouth, and the larynx. In the nasal part of the pharynx it is covered by columnar ciliated epithelium. In the oral and laryngeal portions the epithelium is stratified squamous. Beneath the mucous membrane are found racemose mucous glands. They are especially numerous at the upper part of the pharynx, around the orifices of the auditory tubes. End of section 14. Recording by Leanne Howlett.